Welcome to another episode of American Scandal Report by Skoob. I'm your host, OZ Dalton, and today we're diving deep into one of the most audacious prison breaks in American history, the 1962 Alcatraz escape. This isn't just a story about three men who vanished into the San Francisco Bay. It's a tale of meticulous planning, resourcefulness, and a mystery that has captivated the world for over 6 decades. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about America's most notorious prison escape. Let me paint you a picture of Alcatraz Island before we get into the escape itself. Today, you can hop on a ferry from Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. It'll cost you about $45, maybe more depending on the season. And you'll find yourself walking through the same corridors where Al Capone once served his time. It's become a tourist attraction, a place where families take selfies and kids run through the cell blocks. But back before 1963, Alcatraz wasn't some historical curiosity. It was the end of the line. This wasn't a place where petty criminals did their time. No, Alcatraz housed the worst of the worst. The most dangerous, the most escape-prone criminals in America. If you ended up there, you'd been sentenced to lengthy terms, often without any possibility of parole. The prison authorities had one mission: keep these men locked up until they were old, broken, or dead. And here's the thing, Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof. Not just difficult to escape from, but genuinely impossible. When the prison first opened, it created quite a stir in San Francisco. Women's clubs were outraged that the nation's most notorious felons would be housed so close to their city. But the Department of Justice had a simple answer to their concerns. The natural defenses surrounding the island provided all the security they needed. They were talking about the water, of course. The currents around Alcatraz are legendary. At the time of the escape we're going to discuss, the tide was surging past the island at 7 knots. That's approximately 8 miles per hour. Lloyd C. Whaley, a city engineer from San Francisco, made it pretty clear. Small boats could not have bucked that current. He explained that even a robust swimmer leaving Alcatraz would quickly find themselves swept out through the Golden Gate into the fog, long before reaching safe waters. It was an arduous and potentially deadly journey. But here's where it gets interesting. To counter public fears after the first escape from Alcatraz, prison officials needed to prove their security measures worked. James V. Bennett, a high-ranking authority, made a bold declaration. "We intend to make Alcatraz as nearly impregnable as the mind of man can conceive." This wasn't just PR. This was a pledge to restore trust with Warden Johnston and to soothe the anxieties of San Francisco residents who worried about dangerous criminals suddenly appearing on their streets. Yet despite these assurances, something remarkable happened. A teenage girl swam to Alcatraz in 47 minutes. Then another teenage girl not only swam to the island, but circled it completely and returned to San Francisco, looking like she'd merely done a few laps in a community pool. Over the years, swimming across the Golden Gate became an annual event. Members of local swimming clubs would start near Alcatraz and traverse the mile-and-a-half distance to Angel Island in about 20 minutes. And get this, a few years before the famous escape, a health enthusiast completed the swim from Alcatraz to San Francisco while wearing handcuffs. Handcuffs. Now, I know what you're thinking. These were experienced swimmers in peak physical condition. But here's the counter-argument that some people make. An escaping convict has the ultimate motivation working in his favor, the sheer, overwhelming drive to be free. Is that enough to overcome freezing water temperatures, crushing currents, and hypothermia? That's the million-dollar question. Enter Frank Morris. This is where our story really begins, on an ordinary evening in a cell that was anything but ordinary. Morris was trimming his fingernails when he made an observation that would change everything. The nail clipper's arm had a pointed edge designed for cleaning beneath nails. Simple, right? But Morris saw something more. He waited until the corridor was clear of guards, then moved to the vent at the back of his cell. Using that tiny pointed edge, he began meticulously picking away at the concrete surrounding the metal grill. Just a few grains fell to the floor that first night, but it was a start. Morris wasn't acting on impulse. This was calculated, precise planning. He evaluated the utility door's width and determined that the wall behind the cells was approximately a foot thick. The existing vent was only 6 inches high and 10 inches wide, far too small for a man to pass through. He needed at least 10 inches high and 14 inches wide. To understand what he was working with, Morris even borrowed a book on structural engineering from the prison library. Think about that. He was educating himself on how to dismantle the very structure holding him captive. But here's where the genius of the plan becomes clear. Morris understood that timing was everything. A daytime escape was impossible. The island was frequently shrouded in fog, sure, but guards in the towers would spend their time targeting floating logs in the bay for shooting practice. Plus, there were regular half-hour head counts. No, if this was going to work, it had to happen under the cover of darkness. The prison itself, ironically, would provide the perfect cover for his work. There was an intricate system of ducts in the ceiling that connected an air exhaust blower on top of the cell blocks to a large vent hood on the roof. In the past, 7 vents had been dismantled and sealed with bars and concrete, but one vent remained unsealed. It was situated 30 feet above Morris, but if he could access the utility corridor, he might just be able to reach it. Every evening after prisoners returned to their cells following supper, the cell block would erupt in noise. Some inmates practiced musical instruments. Conversations echoed off the concrete walls. It was chaos. And Morris used that chaos brilliantly. While the noise provided cover, he would chip away at the cement surrounding his vent in cell 138, working until just before lights out at 9:30 p.m. Each night, he'd stuff the growing hole with a mixture of toilet paper and soap to hide his progress. But Morris knew he couldn't do this alone. Morris decided to bring in the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence. Now Clarence had a reputation. He was known for his skills in escaping, and together with his brother, they were the perfect additions to the plan. Morris shared every detail, and the brothers immediately got to work on their own vents. They improvised tools, pilfering spoon handles from the dining room. One brother would chip away while the other kept watch for guards. It was a well-choreographed operation. Morris would casually lean his accordion case against his vent to hide the work. Alan West, who was also in on the plan, placed his guitar similarly. John Anglin hung a raincoat to cover his progress. Night after night, 7 days a week, they worked. Can you imagine the discipline that took? The patience? One wrong sound, one guard happening by at the wrong moment, and it would all be over. They'd be discovered, punished, and any hope of escape would evaporate. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Because for them, freedom wasn't just a dream. It was becoming a tangible possibility with every grain of concrete that fell away. June 11th, 1962. After months of painstaking work, the night finally arrived. Over the course of a full year, these men had used spoons, to carve holes in their cell walls. Those holes led to an unmonitored service corridor, exactly as Morris had planned. Once through, they had access to that vent system, that 30-foot climb Morris had been calculating since the beginning. But getting out of their cells was only half the battle. They still had to get off the island. And that's where their resourcefulness really shines. These men had crafted a makeshift raft from raincoats, sealed together with contact cement. Think about the ingenuity required to even conceive of such a thing, let alone execute it while under constant surveillance. The escape happened in darkness, exactly as Morris had planned from the start. And here's the remarkable part. It took 8 full hours before their absence was detected. 8 hours? In that time, they vanished completely. They were never apprehended, never found. To this day, the official position is uncertain about whether they survived, but the evidence suggests something far more intriguing. So did they make it? Let's look at what we know. After the escape, a crucial piece of information emerged. Alfred's cellmate revealed that Frank Morris spoke Spanish, a detail that's confirmed in FBI reports. The cellmate was convinced that Morris, along with John and Clarence, had successfully fled the United States and were hiding in Mexico, specifically around Guadalajara, about 300 miles from Mexico City. Now, you might think this was just prison gossip, but the FBI took it seriously enough to investigate. And it wasn't just one inmate making these claims. Another prisoner told the FBI that through the prisoner grapevine, he'd heard that John, Clarence, and Frank had safely arrived in Mexico. Then there's the story of the postcard. An inmate claimed he saw a postcard from Mexico in the possession of Warden Blackwell, allegedly from the escapees themselves. This postcard story was later confirmed to a group of journalists who visited Alcatraz after it closed in 1963. The consensus among prisoners was clear. The escapees hadn't just survived, they'd made it to Mexico. But where did this information come from originally? Someone had to leak it, either deliberately or accidentally. The prime suspects were notorious inmates like James Bulger, Mickey Cohen, Alan West, or perhaps another convict who overheard conversations during mealtimes or in the exercise yard while the escape was being planned. Once the information got out, it spread through the prison population like wildfire until it became accepted as fact. Warden Blackwell himself remained quiet about the postcard initially, but he did confirm its existence during a press briefing on March 21st, 1963, when the prison was being shut down. This gave the FBI a conceivable location to pursue the escapees. The problem was, Mexico is enormous. It wasn't until February 1964, when Alfred's cellmate provided a more precise location, that agents could narrow their search. They were also watching Mickey Cohen's drug dealings closely, which gave them a reasonable chance of discovering his farm outside Mexico City, where they hoped the escapees might be hiding. But here's where the story takes another turn. Despite the tragic loss of their brother, a key tip came from Fred Brizzi following Alfred's death. This provided a much-needed lead, but for John, Clarence, and Frank, the constant threat of capture drove them even further, ultimately to Brazil, and that meant relinquishing any chance of reuniting with their families. Now, I want you to understand something about what this escape meant for the families left behind. For decades, they lived with questions, with hope, with fear, and some of them knew more than they could ever say publicly. When Don Denevy, the author who later wrote Riddle of the Rock, expressed his desire to write a book about the escape in 1990, the family saw it as an opportunity to tell the true story about their uncles. But in 2014, they discovered something shocking. Denevy was working with the US Marshals. The Marshals were hoping he could extract information about John and Clarence's whereabouts from Uncle Man. That's what the family called him. It's surprising that Uncle Man agreed to participate in the book at all. In the end, the family received only a few $100s for their contribution. As for the US Marshals, they got nothing. Uncle Man might have been deceived, but he wasn't a fool. He would never disclose where his nephews were hiding. But then something remarkable happened. Uncle Man invited Fred Brizzi, his childhood friend, to meet the family. Fred presented what's now known as the famous photo of John and Clarence in Brazil. He never revealed their exact location, but he wanted to assure the family that the brothers were safe and that they shouldn't worry. When the FBI released their official report in 2002, it became clear why the US Marshals believed Uncle Man knew more than he was letting on. Of all the family members the authorities interviewed over the years, he was the only one subjected to a polygraph test, and he passed it. But despite his denials, Uncle Man couldn't explain the story told by Alfred's cellmate back in 1964. The FBI had good reasons to suspect he knew more, and the final confirmation came from Uncle Man himself in 2009, just before his death. He shared with his daughter and granddaughter that his nephews were doing fine and that he'd been in regular contact with them for over 25 years. The author only learned about this confession on the 50th anniversary of the escape in 2012. Can you imagine carrying that secret for a quarter century? Knowing your family members were alive, were safe, but being unable to tell anyone? That takes a different kind of courage. Not the courage to escape, but the courage to protect those who did. Meanwhile, law enforcement was dealing with an absolute frenzy. After the escape, the public reported sightings of the men almost constantly. Calls flooded in about 2 men seen in a car. Reports about phantom yachts suggested numerous sailing vessels that never actually existed. The hysteria spread throughout California, where every criminal with a firearm seemed to match the description of the fugitives. They were reportedly appearing as hitchhikers along highways throughout the western United States. But these leads were like trying to catch smoke. No concrete evidence ever materialized. One incident particularly fueled speculation. 2 young boys discovered a skull on a desolate beach and removed 2 gold teeth from it. Initially, authorities thought this might be connected to the escapees, but it was later determined that neither Cole nor Rowe— Wait, I should clarify. These were from an earlier escape attempt. Not Morris and the Anglins, had gold teeth anyway. 4 years after the 1962 escape, the San Francisco Chronicle published an exclusive article claiming that the fugitives were living in luxury in South America. However, this story remained unverified, and no further evidence substantiated the claims. The question of survival persisted precisely because of those formidable natural barriers I mentioned earlier. Remember Lloyd C. Whaley's assessment? That current moving at 8 miles per hour, that fog, the cold water that could induce hypothermia in minutes. These weren't just obstacles, they were potential death sentences. Over time, the prison break evolved into something much larger than the event itself. Initially, it was simply a story about three inmates who managed to break out of jail. But as years rolled by, it morphed into a full blown saga. John, Clarence, and Frank became cultural icons through the film Escape from Alcatraz, books, television shows, and documentaries. Even today, the Escape from Alcatraz triathlon draws participants who are inspired by this famous incident. The escape captured the public imagination in a way few crimes ever have. Why? I think it's because it represents something universal: the human desire for freedom, the triumph of determination over impossible odds, the little guy beating the system. Whether they survived or not, whether what they did was right or wrong, there's something undeniably compelling about their audacity. Think about what they accomplished with the limited resources available to them. They used nail clippers and spoons as excavation tools. They studied structural engineering to understand their prison. They created a raft from raincoats. They worked every single night for a year without being discovered. This wasn't luck, this was planning, patience, and precision. And that brings me to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire story: what it teaches us about resourcefulness and the human capacity for problem solving when properly motivated. Imagine you're wrongfully imprisoned on Alcatraz Island. You've been convicted for life with no opportunity for appeal. You're facing a dire situation with only two options: endure unjust punishment for someone else's offense, or craft a means of escape. The inclination to escape would be overwhelming, but how would you proceed? As a wrongfully convicted individual, you might lack formal training in criminal activities, but prison life offers ample opportunity for planning and strategizing. Such an endeavor requires a wide array of skills. Perhaps your background could land you a position in the prison administration wing, enabling you to gather critical resources and gain comprehensive knowledge of potential escape routes. Developing an escape plan might necessitate skills you haven't used in years, like replicating a key using prison soap, reminiscent of crafting projects from childhood. Social skills become crucial, whether to win over a sympathetic guard or to learn their routines without raising suspicion. And while violence might not be preferable in your bid for freedom, learning self-defense could be wise should you need to protect yourself. The parallels to modern life are striking. Most of us aren't in physical prisons, but many people feel trapped in careers or circumstances they desperately want to escape. The principles are the same: assess your resources, develop new skills, plan meticulously, and execute with precision. Take the example I came across of someone named Daniel. He faced the abrupt acceptance of his resignation, leaving him without a job. As he sat by a lake contemplating his dreams and goals alongside his competencies, this self-reflection guided him toward a new direction. People who successfully extricate themselves from confining situations, whether literal or metaphorical, thrive when concentrating on enhancing the right skills, not merely any skills. They understand two critical truths. Every person has an area of expertise, often unrelated to formal education or conventional career tasks. Sometimes hidden or underutilized, these skills can be unveiled and nurtured toward achieving a more fulfilling transition. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers weren't trained escape artists. They were criminals, yes, but the skills they used to escape Alcatraz — patience, planning, engineering knowledge, teamwork — these are skills anyone can develop. So where does that leave us? More than 60 years after that June night in 1962, we still don't have definitive answers. The official investigation concluded without finding bodies or capturing the men alive. The US Marshal Service keeps the case open to this day, which tells you something about their uncertainty. But we do have that cellmate testimony about Mexico. We have the warden's confirmation about the postcard. We have Fred Brizzi's photograph from Brazil. We have Uncle Man's deathbed confession that he'd been in contact with them for 25 years. When you add it all up, the evidence pointing towards survival is compelling. Consider the logistics. If they made it to shore, and given 8 hours before discovery, they had time, they would have needed help. Money, transportation, new identities. The prison grapevine suggested Mickey Cohen's involvement, with his drug connections and that farm outside Mexico City. Could the notorious gangster have provided a safe house? A route to South America? It's not implausible. And Brazil makes sense as a final destination. In the 1960s, Brazil had no extradition treaty with the United States for many crimes. It's a massive country where three men could disappear into the population, especially if they spoke Spanish or Portuguese. The constant threat of capture from Mexico would have necessitated another move, and Brazil offered both distance and legal protection. But accepting that they made it to Brazil means accepting that John and Clarence gave up any chance of seeing their families again. That Frank Morris abandoned any possibility of proving his intelligence could be used for something other than crime. That's a heavy price for freedom. The 1962 Alcatraz escape endures not because we know the truth, but because we don't. Three men, a raft stitched from raincoats, and the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, vanishing into fog with nothing but determination and a plan a year in the making. Their escape shattered the myth of an inescapable prison and exposed flaws that would soon help seal Alcatraz's fate. Did Morris and the Anglin brothers drown in the bay? Or did they reach freedom and disappear forever? Even decades of FBI investigation couldn't deliver a definitive answer. That uncertainty is what keeps the legend alive, an impossible escape that may have actually succeeded. But there's one overlooked detail, one clue that could change everything about what really happened that night, and it's far more chilling than most people realize. Download Skoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover the mystery behind one of America's greatest prison escapes.